thank everybody who's joining us today. I'm Camilla Bullock and I lead the Emerging Payments Association Asia. And if you haven't met us before, we are let's do that for the meantime. We are the leading branch organization for participants in the payments industry in APAC, and we focus on advocacy and policy to enhance the payments industry with a vision of improving lives everywhere. One of our favorite topics is cross-border payments. So delighted to have this hot topic briefing here today. And in cross-border payments, we have an active working group where we focus on different things. So our members gives us ideas what is trending, what we'd like to have an event on or host a discussion around. We have the Global Payments Forum, which feeds straight into the work that FSB and the G20 is doing, but we also have several activities in our market here. Among others, the APAC FinTech Payments Forum, which we are delighted to host together with 14 of the leading FinTech association. And we were really picking up on a lot of what's happening in our different markets. I think it's known globally that our region is leading in innovation in payments. So we're always very proud to take our stories out in the globe. We host events frequently on lots of different topics, from ISO 20022, and that's impact on cross-border payments, or on alternative rails, CBDC. I mean, there is no limits on the topics we can choose, and you all know that it's really hard to stay on top of what's happening. Hence, we are delighted to have the Bank of International Settlement, the Innovation Hub, here today with Ben and Yip, who's going to talk about where they are on the Nexus project. Some of you might have seen the really brilliant webinar they did a couple of weeks ago, which was really detailed and talked us all the way through the POC. So we'll have a shorter presentation today, and then we're going to have more discussion. As you can see, it's several of us on the screen today. So we're going to talk about the key learnings from Nexus, both out of a technical perspective, but also out of a regulatory perspective. And to host this discussion, I'm delighted to have our ambassador, Monica Yosuya, who's based in Indonesia, original from India. She's been working all over the world, from US, Taiwan, Singapore, always in those project and business leader roles, and how translating and creating customer digital financial solutions. Many of you have probably seen her before. She is a thought leader and influencer. She's been named the top 15 influencers in FinTech and one of the top 50 business-to-business leaders in APAC. So Monica, I'm going to let you introduce the panel and lead this discussion today.
Absolutely. So let's get started. And thank you so much, Camilla, for the wonderful opportunity to, first of all, host these wonderful panelists and also learn so much from them, as we are all expecting to do. Today, we are going to be speaking about Project Nexus, and we have with us Ben Dyson, who is an advisor at BIS Innovation Hub in Singapore, where he is responsible for developing Nexus, a blueprint for instant cross-border payments. Prior to joining the hub in September 2020, Ben was at the Bank of England, where he led work on CBDCs, as well as developing policy and regulation on crypto assets and stablecoins. He was the lead author on the Bank of England's first discussion paper on CBDC. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks,
then
Monica.
Thank you. We have Karkit. Karkit is an advisor at the BIS Innovation Hub in Singapore, where he serves as the policy and governance lead for Project Nexus. He is on secondment from the Central Bank of Malaysia. During his time in BNM, he was instrumental in driving the country's migration to digital payments and fostering the development of open and interoperable real-time payments. He has also led the Digital Currency Research Hub and spearheaded the policy and market development work in financial market infrastructures and cross-border payments. Welcome, Karkit.
Thanks, Monica. Hello, everyone.
Then we want to welcome Zhang Yinfan. Yinfan Zhang leads engagement strategy with overseas governments to and financial and groups relationship with various policymakers, regulators, and academics based in Shanghai. Prior to working for the Ant Group, he had worked in the UK Department for International Trade for 7 years, where he led the capital markets, asset management, and fintech team to develop policy objectives in support of trade and investment opportunities between the UK and China, as well as developing bilateral collaboration in financial services via several UK-China working groups on capital markets, closeout netting, and green finance. Welcome, Yin Pan.
Thank you, Monica. Delighted to be joining you.
Thank you so much. And last, we have Stephen Peters from FIS. Stephen, would you be able to give a quick 30-second introduction of yourself?
Yes, absolutely. And good afternoon, everyone. My name's Stephen Peters. I'm based in Singapore, where I work for FIS Global, and my job is to build and deliver solutions in the enterprise payment space for banks around the region.
Thank you so much. So we have an absolutely wonderful panel of speakers and absolute experts. Before we dive into the small presentation that BIS will be giving to us on Project Nexus, just wanted to draw attention to a lot of the news headlines over the past couple of months with unilateral connections that are, or bilateral connections that are happening the world over. Recently, the India UPI system was connected to Singapore's Pay Now. Earlier, Singapore's Pay Now was connected to Thailand PromptPay, and this is just the beginning. With Project Nexus, we hopefully will be able to achieve the G20 targets for cross-border payments, which helps in and earmarks how the countries can come together to reduce the speed, increase the speed, increase transparency, and reduce the cost and fees associated with cross-border payments. So really looking forward to understanding what Project Nexus does. So I'll hand over to the BIS team for their presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Can we get the slides up, please? Thanks, Camilla. Let us start by giving you a quick overview of Project Nexus, the work that we have done during the POC, as well as giving you a sneak peek of the next phase of the work in this project. Next slide, please. So the genesis of Project Nexus is very much inspired by the success of instant payment system that we have seen in domestic markets in over 60 jurisdictions to date. So typically in the domestic jurisdiction, fast payment system allow payments to be processed 24/7 and also on an instantaneous basis. And our vision is really to see how we can bring the benefits of fast payment system that we currently enjoy today from the domestic space to the cross-border arena. Next slide, please. Slide before that. So bilateral linkages of fast payment system has already been a reality now. And as Monica has highlighted just now, Thailand has linked up their fast payment system with Singapore, and recently India has also done so together with Singapore. And that has benefited the users in both countries, where payments can be made instantaneously by just using a convenient proxy, such as a mobile phone number or an email address. And as you can see from the slide, there are many bilateral linkages work that has been spearheaded, not only in this region, but also in other parts of the world. Next slide, please. But bilateral interlinking is not scalable. As you can see from the chart, 3 countries will require 3 links, 4 countries, 6 links. And if we extrapolate that to 60 countries, we will require 1,770 links. So it is perhaps humanly not possible for that to be achieved. And hence, the idea of Project Nexus is born, whereby we are trying to see how we can develop a multilateral model that will enable fast payment system to be connected in a more streamlined manner. And with that, let me hand over to my colleague Ben Dyson to take us through the key findings of the POC.
Thanks, Karkit. So the idea of Nexus really is to take a more standardized approach to connecting multiple instant payment systems together. And the way we do this is through some software that we call the Nexus Gateway. And the idea is that each instant payment system operator at a because of the standard, it makes it much easier to scale those instant cross-border connections. So we have tested this through a technical proof of concept, which ran throughout the last year. And that was linking the Euro system, the fast payment system in Singapore, and the fast payment system in Malaysia. And we asked each of those countries to create a replica of their domestic payment system, and also the proxy services that allow you to send mobile phone numbers to payments to a mobile phone number. And we connected those systems together through the software, through using things like ISO 20022 and RESTful APIs. And so rather than going into a lot of technical detail on how exactly we did that, I'd like to show you an example of how this could look for the end user. So the customer who's actually sending a payment through a bank or payment service provider that uses Nexus. So if we imagine that Maria in Italy is trying to send money to Wei Long in Singapore, and she wants to send exactly 100 Singapore dollars. So the first thing she would have to do, and just to be clear, there isn't a Nexus app. This is an example of how it might look if it was integrated into your own bank's mobile app. But the first thing they would have to do is choose the country. And that would allow the bank to send a request to Nexus saying what FX rates are available on the market for payments from euros to Singapore. And so those rates would come back. The bank would choose one of the FX providers. That rate would be guaranteed for around 10 minutes so that the customer has time to set that payment up before, without having to refresh those rates. The next thing is that they would have to address that payment. And what we've done in Nexus is said that any details that are valid for addressing a payment domestically, so within the same country, should also be valid through Nexus. So in Singapore, you can use the Pay Now service to send payments to a phone number, to a national ID number, or a company registration number. And that would also be possible through Nexus as well. We would connect to the Pay Now service in Singapore to allow that to happen. So if we imagine they enter the Singaporean mobile number here for Wei Long, they would then have an opportunity to confirm who they're sending funds to. So they would see the name of the account holder that they have entered the details for. And that's a really important prevention against fraud in cross-border instant payments. And then finally, they would have an opportunity to review all of the details. And within the Nexus scheme that we're developing, there are rules around transparency. So we require that the sender of a payment is informed about what will be deducted from their account, exactly how much will be credited to the recipient in the recipient's currency, what fees they will be charged, and what exchange rate will be applied. So we try to give all of that information up front and give the sender certainty about how much will be received at the other end. So now the payment is sent, and that is sent through, in this example, first through the TIPS payment system in the Euro system, then through Nexus, and then through the fast payment system in Singapore. And what we think is that the majority of payments will complete in less than 60 seconds, or they will fail with certainty. So you have certainty about whether that payment has been successful or not. There are around 10 to 15% of payments that will be caught by the sanction screening software. And often when a payment triggers an alert, it's actually a false positive. So it's somebody with a similar name to somebody on the sanctions list. And those payments require a little bit of extra time, either for the banks to request further information from each other, or for this payment to be manually reviewed. So we have built in a flow for non-time critical payments where they can take a little bit of extra time. But again, what we're hoping is that the majority of payments will go through in less than 60 seconds. Okay, so with that, I'll hand back to Karkit to talk about our next steps with this project.
Thanks, Ben. So with the completion of the POC, we have received interest from 5 Southeast Asia banks, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and also Thailand, to use Nexus as a framework for regional connectivity. And maybe just to dial back the clock by about 6 months, in November 2022, the 5 ASEAN countries have signed an MOU to interlink their respective payment systems. And one of the modality for the regional connectivity would be in the area of fast payments. And as such, we will be working closely with these 5 ASEAN countries to realize their vision of regional payment connectivity. Next slide, please. So over the course of the next 12 months, we will be structuring our work across 3 key work streams. The first one will be on technology and operations, where we look towards enhancing the tech specification that we have developed during the POC to production grade level. In addition to that, we will also be refining the scheme and governance framework that we have developed during the POC, such that it would be at the level that can both facilitate inclusivity and also agility in terms of decision-making and management of the scheme. And last but not least would be the business and commercial model. Before any payment system can be implemented in the real world, it is important to ensure that there is a viable business model that would not only ensure that the relevant costs can be recovered, but also set aside sufficient funds to facilitate future innovation and enhancements. So last but not least, all the details of the POC have been published in our report, as well as in our microsite in the BIS portal. So it's not just the high-level findings, but also the technical specification that we have developed. And we really welcome everyone to have a look at this microsite and provide comments to us. And this will really help us to refine the Nexus blueprint moving forward. So with that short presentation, I will now hand back to the moderator, Monica.
Thank you so much. I think this makes it so much more clearer, as well as to everybody who really did not understand the scope of the project and why we are doing this. But I would like to actually go back to a little bit of how you started out by explaining what Project Nexus is, explaining what the exact problem statement was that you are hoping to address with Project Nexus, and what led to this need for blueprint for cross-border payments.
Yeah, maybe I can take that question, Monica. So we are very much inspired by the success of the bilateral linkages. Thailand and Singapore linkage was the first in the world, and it really helped to enhance the efficiency of cross-border payments. But we also see the problem in terms of the lack of scalability of bilateral linkages. If bilateral linkages were to prevail, then only the most commercially viable corridors will see linkages. And hence, there will be large parts of the world they may not be connected. And hence, that is the problem statement that that inspire us to develop a model, a multilateral model, which is in the form of the Nexus blueprint that we have developed over the past 2 to 3 years.
That absolutely makes sense, especially given the whole G20 goal of actually reducing the cost of payments. So these bilateral linkages would obviously not be able to scale. So question to Ben. I know that you spoke to us and walked us through what the user experience will look like, but wanted to also ask you a little bit about the proof of concept of Project Nexus, and what are some of the key findings and outcomes that have been learned or lessons learned from that particular phase of rollout that you would like to share with the group?
Of course. So the I would say one of the first things we realize is just how much difference there is between the different payment systems in the message formats that they use, the kind of data that's shared, the processes. You have different settlement models, real time versus deferred net settlement. And so we very quickly realized that we cannot impose standardization on every instant payment system. We have to minimize the number of changes made domestically, and also try to minimize the changes that have to be made by individual banks as well. And so we've taken a very kind of flexible approach in Nexus. There is one thing that we do impose, which is that all communication with Nexus must be in ISO 20022, which is the payment message standard, which has been adopted across the industry. But if a domestic system doesn't use that, then they can translate to ISO 20022 before communicating with Nexus. But beyond that, we've managed to develop a kind of model where if you do deferred net settlement within your domestic payment system, that's fine. If you do immediate settlement in central bank money, for example, in Australia, or in the TIPS system in the Euro system, that's also fine. So probably one of the most challenging things that we found, though, was around sanction screening, and the fact that most bank systems are just not able to make these decisions in real time, that the screening software generates a high number of false positives, so legitimate payments that are being flagged as illicit, and that at the moment we're not making very good use of APIs and allowing those systems to speak to each other between the banks in order to resolve those sanction hits without manual intervention. And so that's one of the things that the industry needs to work on. We've done a few things in Nexus to make that easier, but I can't say that we've solved that. It's a very big challenge.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess the next phase of the rollout will involve a lot more countries. So would these learnings and be addressed during that phase?
Yes, that's definitely the intention, is to take the lessons from this proof of concept and then make sure that what we have developed is applicable to the 5 countries that we're working with: Singapore, Thailand, yes, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And we will, we'll continue to make improvements to Nexus. There may also have to be some changes domestically. Sometimes that's unavoidable.
Absolutely, that makes sense. And it will take a little bit of time for things to stabilize before it becomes available for more scalability across countries. But great time to actually go to Yinfan for the next question associated with what Ben has just discussed with us based on the blueprint, and of course some great learnings that have come through with the first phase of the project already. What are your views on the findings and the rollout creation countries, specifically from the policy perspective? What do you see will be certain challenges that you are able to foresee for non-FIs in this rollout plan? And since only the governments and central banks are working with each other.
Thank you, Monica. First of all, I want to thank everyone for having me. And I'm speaking not with my aunt hat, but I think I'm today speaking more from the industry perspective with all the emerging payment association members, especially the non-FI. So that's where my thinking comes from. And you raise a very interesting question about government and regulators' role in the entire project Nexus. And I would say even more beyond that is the entire G20 cross-border payment roadmap. And I think from the industry's perspective, I think we welcome this approach. And I think without that, it's not impossible for us to be where we are today. So it is necessary to have this top to bottom approach. And I think Kit had mentioned, if we only have this bilateral, even commercial linkage between 2 countries with the 60 countries with the instant payment structure, that's the national instant payment structure. But if we allow, the commercial emerging payment wallets to connect, that even multiply that number across 10,000 of different linkages. So I think the clear picture outlined from the very top end G20 perspective, which I will call it a global government governance, and then that structure commission the financial regulators, BIS, FSB, to find out the targets, set out the goals, is very critical. Otherwise, we can't, identify the 4 key targets: cheaper, faster, more transparent, and more accessible in such a short time. And I think all our project Nexus, and all these bilateral connectivity, even the Singapore Thailand Pay Now PromptPay Connect, is somehow connect with this overarching structure. So I think it is indeed a safeguard to have governments and regulators to make sure most of our bilateral, trilateral, or even multilateral initiatives in cross-border payment are in line with this goal, and therefore make the interoperability possible from the very beginning of the formulation of all these initiatives, even if all our markets take very different approaches and practice as you outlined. So I think particularly this is important because from a technological perspective, especially from the non-FIs for the e-wallets, I think we have all the tech solutions ready, but still without this overarching governance structure, we cannot address the topics around lower cost, easy access, and lack of transparency, especially. And I want to elaborate a little bit more on the lack of transparency and taking probably remittance as an example, which I think Project Nexus is all about. And in a single remittance action, I think actually that involves several intermediary agents throughout the entire very long chain. The sender basically will lose the control once the remittance order is made to, I would say, its direct facing intermediaries. The failure of even just not being proactively pushing the remittance by any of the agents within this chain will lead to huge delay in clearing settlement circle, and for the receiver and the sender, the experience will be very limited information to be able to help them to monitor the progress. And especially if we are talking about multi-currency remittance across multi-time zones, then I think that will be a real problem. And that's exactly why we are talking about the next generation of payment market infrastructure. And I think the current system has been there with its current status for too long. And we have already mentioned the bilateral G2G connectivities. But if all these G2G initiatives fails, and even if they are keeping the pace with the current evolving of the current market development, still we have new challenges. We have challenges from the crypto industries. And I'm speaking here as the Emerging Payment Association member, but actually, even for me, I think e-wallets, e-payments is no longer emerging at all. We are already conventional compared to new practices, the crypto ones. So the existing legacy and differences between all these jurisdictions, indeed, they are challenging, but we need to be clear, this is not the only one. We actually are facing other challenges while we are dealing with these legacy problems. So I think this brings I will say the reason why we need Project Nexus. And Project Nexus, I think it's a bridge. It's a bridge between the G20 perspective, the G20 targets, and what we are here struggling as the local practitioner in this market, especially Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore. And personally, I do think Project Nexus, I don't think they own the final product solution, but they provide a minimum, most common ground for all of us. And then the private sector come into this public initiative. Then we form a partnership, contribute our, I would say, capability and understanding of different local markets needs. Then we address the question, which is, I would say, sometimes missing in all these governmental initiatives, which is the last mile question, how we finally address the needs from the final user, the final beneficiary of our big dreams. And I think in our markets, that's the end individual users, normally attached to a family or a business owner, normally from an SME, particularly in our market in Asia. So I think that's where I see the role the private sector can do, and not only the FIs, but the non-FIs, because to be honest, the non-FIs started from the SMEs. We started from the unbanked group, the unbanked community, and inclusion, accessibility, I think is all about that. And I will also address to the technological side. I think Ben mentioned the sanction screening, and I think that's also something non-FIs will have a role to play. Because when we look at Project Nexus or other bilateral connectivity or other wider next generation payment infrastructure, exactly what we are looking for, I would say real-time settlement, CBDC's involvement and accessible to everyone. That's what we're looking for. But isn't digital technology, in the name of either eKYC, EAML, e-sanction screening, RegTech, SupTech, are actually the underlying technology to make real-time settlements and all these changes possible, and especially on the multi-currency and cross-border basis. And I think most of the non-FIs, especially digital wallets, e-wallets, have already been exploring these practice. Not to mention Visa and MasterCard, they have been doing that for years. And I think Alipay, where my company, we also start to explore that in Southeast Asia and East Asia by the launch of the Alipay solution. So I think there is a lot we can work together, and we welcome the active role that government is leading and the active, bridging the regulator is doing. And I think I would expect not only us, but other members from EPAA and all these practitioners in the emerging markets, emerging payment community to think about how we participate in this structure and what is our role and duty in contributing this scheme, and to join the Project Nexus concept, but make it a commercial product for our end users. I think that is my sharing for now. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you so much. I think from understanding what Project Nexus is all about to understanding the outcome of the phase-wise rollout that has just happened, to also understanding the point of view from a policy as well as from a non-FI perspective of how a G2G solution in a bilateral fashion has now become a framework or a rollout plan, which will involve both participating institutions on the FIs and maybe at some point also non-FIs. But the one part that you have touched upon that we need to deep dive a little bit more on is the technology side of the implementation. So if I could go to you, Stephen, and ask you, now you've seen the overview of what this framework looks like. So can you provide an overview of what will be some of the technical challenges as well as the opportunities for the participating institutions who need to implement this blueprint for cross-border payments? And how do you think Project Nexus helps address these challenges in its current state?
Sure. Thanks, Monica. I think there's technical challenges at several levels. It's been mentioned the necessity for sanction screening and having a regime which is more or less equivalent across all the different members, I think is critical at the network level. I'd be interested to see how the model becomes realized, how centralized versus decentralized it will be, because that will be reflective of certain political considerations amongst the ASEAN Big Five. Stepping out one layer into the banking members and the banks that need to connect into that, which is really my domain area. The banks themselves will be very happy to have an additional network option to reach beneficiaries. I think that's great. I am a little bit concerned about the quality of operational scenarios, especially around exceptions, and how you will balance that across the different regimes. That will be interesting. Not necessarily a technical issue, but certainly something to become a consideration for future design. And of course, having the member settlement processes aligned. Now, coming to access regimes and how non-FIs become members, that I think will be certainly a future goal for the network and for ASEAN as a whole, and really important that we get non-FI participation. But of course, it comes with some risks and certain other operational considerations before that can happen. And I'm sure that the team at BIS is working that out. So I think fundamentally, from a bank's perspective, they definitely want options to offer to their customers for cross-border networks. So you have SWIFT, of course, which has additional controls and additional parameters. It is also a bit more expensive and a bit slower. That will still play a role in certain payments. And for the lower value real-time payments that we're talking about here within the RTP networks, certainly I think reaching customers within the 60 seconds, if we can have good fund settlement, I think that's a really good outcome. Technology-wise, as I said, I don't think there's really major concerns. It is not super challenging. I think most of the obstacles exist at the political and the operational level.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And not going into the political or geographic struggles associated with this project or with other countries that will be participating in this, but just wanted to go to Kakit and Ben, if you wanted to just quickly talk about any of or wanted to address the challenges that Stephen had spoken about before we go to the next question.
Yes.
If you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think both Yin Fan and also Stephen has talked about the access regime. So I think our current thinking in the Nexus blueprint is that we will leverage on the access regime that has been implemented in the respective IPS systems around the world. And it is not uniform. And that's something that I noticed. There are countries where the access are limited to banks, but there is a growing number of countries, including some in Southeast Asia, for instance, Malaysia and Indonesia, Singapore, and also Thailand, that has allowed non-bank financial institutions to plug into the instant payment system. So in a way, they do already have access to the customers of other financial institutions within a domestic context. So if we were to scale that to the cross-border level, then not only banks will benefit, but also non-banks who are plugged into the instant payment system would also benefit from such IPS payments connectivity. So having said that, we always advocate for instant payment system operators around the world to adopt what we call fair and open access regime, where the access is guided on the risk-based perspective, such that as long as any institution, be it banks or non-banks, are able to fulfill the minimal risk management and also perhaps financial requirements, then there shouldn't be any barrier for such institution to participate or to link up with the instant payment systems.
That makes absolute sense. And in fact, you helped answer the question that I had for you, which was about how are different institutions or participating institutions will find a way to be able to not only participate, but also help maybe in setting up fees and understanding how the governance framework looks like. So that makes absolute sense. I'd love to be able to address another question which is related, which is that with every, and since you've also brought this up, since the RTP rail of every country participating in this program is essentially different from each other, how do you think Asia will lead the way to connect these various RTP rails across borders as well as technical architectures to create this unified synergy that we will see emerging from the Asia side of the world this time around?
Yeah, maybe I can speak to that. So I think, the bilateral initiatives in Asia have been impressive and, really innovative and kind of leading the world in connecting instant payment systems together. I think already what some of the central banks involved in those initiatives and also the industry are realizing is that it's hard to do this country by country. Because every time you're taking a slightly different approach, there's all of these, legal negotiations, technical negotiations. It's a very big project to do at once, and so I think what we have an opportunity to do with the 5 countries in the ASEAN region that we're working with is find this kind of standardized way of doing it, so that if you look at the kind of bilateral scaling that we showed before, the number of links that you would need to connect 5 countries, it's either 10 bilateral initiatives, or if you use a multilateral approach, it's just 5 integrations to Nexus. Once that is done, and I think actually Martin has asked a question that's relevant to this, which is how do you make this attractive for the participants? Now, if you're building a bilateral link, the potential revenue and the potential volumes going through that bilateral link is limited to the trade or the payments going between those two countries. If you're building multilaterally, every new link adds significantly more value. Your real cost and investment comes up front, but from then on, whenever somebody else joins the network, you get increasing value from that, more potential volumes and revenue from that. And so I think it lowers the cost of building these instant payment links, and it also increases the returns that the participants will get from that over time.
Thank you so much, Ben. This really helps understanding how this will all work. But I wanted to come, and I'm going to bounce this question off to every panelist here, which is about something that is of interest to everyone who hears the word cross-border payments, which are some of the challenges are obviously got to do with cost, transparency, the fees, the time taken, etc. So how does Project Nexus actually address these challenges, both from a policy as well as from a technical standpoint, given the linkages between the countries and unification across borders? So maybe I can take this question first to Infan, and then I'll kind of go back in order. Infan, would you like to address this?
I think still it's the balancing between the national level and the global cross-border level. I think the way Project Nexus do is it wasn't that ambitious to be not realistic. So actually Project Nexus picked a very specific region to start the initiative with. But I think whether the practice and experience we have in Asia will apply to Europe and will apply to East Asia, will apply to North America, I think there is a question there. So I think we need to be realistic from the very beginning that we will need to admire the differences between these different stages of payment, different situation in their traditions and all the legacies. But on the other hand, we should also think about how technology can address these issues, because our assumption is still based on the existing framework. But if we are looking forward to a CBDC era, especially on this wholesale market perspective, we'll have digital, ECNY, we'll probably have digital euro, we'll have digital Singapore dollar, and potentially digital pound, and maybe digital dollar. And when all this comes, the entire ecosystem will change, and all our assumptions based on the current infrastructure will change. But by that time, I think projects like Project Nexus has already been done the fundamental research for us. So that will make the global unification possible. But at the moment, I would suggest we should still focus on the regional basis rather than having a global BIS global hub or project, but actually regional projects by region and by practice. And if we finish the next phase of Project Nexus and we have more commercial interest from the practitioners, then Project Nexus will prove to be a feasible one. And then it will be copied by the others, either by the commercial ones, by commercial motivations, or by the other regulators, by global governance motivations. But that will make the balance between, I would say, the attempt to make it global, but also admiring the reality of the huge differences we are facing in different continents.
Absolutely. And I'd like to take this question also to Stephen. So Stephen, from the technical standpoint, what do you feel would be how these challenges are being addressed in Project Nexus from the cross-border payments perspective?
Sure. So I think there is other than the blueprint provided by Nexus, we actually have live examples. So you have SEPA and the SEPA Credit Transfer Instant Initiative. TIPS was a member of the POC. You also have a little bit more meaningful is P27, which is multi-country, multi-currency. And that's probably a really direct analogy to Nexus, and I think there's a lot to be learned from there. As I said, there's no major technical integrations or challenges other than scale, and scale needs to address sanctions as well as clearing and settlement at the scale that the network will reach. And P27 is rather small in scale relative to ASEAN and a number of possible members. And separate credit transfers instant is not yet mandatory across the entire Eurozone, but could be huge. I think it's already more than 1 million transactions a day. It could be huge. But again, it's a single currency model for now. So, those guys are sort of presenting some real world guidance from a technical perspective. It is, I think, a concern that ASEAN needs to follow. There are lots and lots of in the next couple of years as this network is rolled out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And actually, I want to take the next question also on similar lines to all the panelists. But how do you think Project Nexus will be benefiting potentially consumers with both faster as well as cheaper cross-border payments? And do you think this will lead to an increase in global commerce, specifically starting with the Asian region, which is seeing a lot of consumers who are very young and mobile first? And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the user experience, which Ben had and Kakit have referred to in the presentation. So if this unification of user experience or consistency does happen, will it make it easier for participating institutions and consumers alike? So I'll go down the same order. Maybe I can have Kakit or Ben respond first. And
so I think from a consumer perspective, so we started the design process thinking about the end user from the beginning, even though Nexus is kind of behind the scenes infrastructure. And I think the user experience for consumers at the moment of making cross-border payments, it is improving, but it's historically been quite bad. So, addressing a payment, you may need to, you need somebody's name, their full postal address, account details that are, in an unfamiliar format, or maybe an international bank account number that can be 32 characters long. There's a lot of information to be entered there, and that could be entered incorrectly. And so we really wanted to play on, for example, the proxy services that allow you to use just a mobile number or a company number. And so overall, this should be a better user experience. It should be easier for consumers to send payments. Within Nexus, we don't dictate what banks or PSPs could charge those consumers, but what we're hoping is that by lowering the overall cost of building these cross-border links, that will feed through into other benefits for consumers there.
absolutely. And Yin Yang, Zhang, would you like to also answer this question? In terms of potential benefits for the consumers and consistency of user experience?
I think I wouldn't see Project Nexus will be directly connect to end users, because I think it's more a leading concept or leading model, a leading organization, but that actually steered innovation for, I would say, FIs and non-FIs. Actually, we can think, oh, wow, this is possible in such a complex global or regional cross-border regulatory requirement with all these, AML, EKYC standards. But if Project Nexus proved to be feasible, then that will pave the way for all these practitioners to think, okay, that is a feasible approach, and we should think that is our tool to address the user's pain points, the user's experience. And that's why I see the Project Nexus value is. I don't think Project Nexus are going to run its own e-wallet in different markets, Nexus Pay or BIS Pay. But Project Nexus, I think the good part of it leaves the space for the practitioners to collaborate with it. And that's exactly why EPAA today is having this conversation with BIS. And if the BIS Innovation Hub and Project Nexus pave the way for us, and then we follow in, and then there's a protection of consumer rights, but also encourage of the competition, then we let the market to grow up with the final 1 or 2 or 3 best products. So even with Project Nexus, we still need competition and we still need to protect consumer rights. And that is how I would foresee the relationship between participants, regulators, and in the end, the government will be happy. And then again, back to the starting point I made, we start probably from the G20 level and towards the end users. But in the end, we should start from the end users and then back to the G20 level. So that's how I see the benefits will bring from how it will be conveyed to the end users. But if you ask me what will be the exact result or benefits, that's the target of the G20 roadmap. Faster, cheaper, more transparent, and more accessible. And that's been very clear.
Absolutely. So let me actually ask one of the other concerns that are typically both consumers as well as businesses have with cross-border payments, which is about fraud, AML concerns, etc. So again, question to both Stephen as well as to BIS would be the same one. How does Project Nexus actually help address these concerns, which are not just concerns by governments and participating institutions, but once access gets opened up to non-FIs, then this may become a bigger challenge. So how does Project Nexus help address this? So Stephen, if you could, I could.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it was mentioned earlier that Nexus is at the fundamental level using ISO 20022. That will definitely help ensure fidelity and completeness of the different parties in the transaction. Now, data is only good as the source, so garbage in, garbage out. So a lot is going to rely on the different the KYC schemes that the banks run and how good the banks or non-bank participants and how good and complete and rigorous those data collection exercises are. There are a lot of different ways to do addressing, a lot of different ways to do names. My name at least has about 12 different variations, which is probably surprising for English speakers, but it is the case if you look across the different culture groups. So it is a complex exercise to match all of that from an AML sanctions perspective. AML is probably not something in focus here. I just don't think there'll be time for that within a 60-second cycle, but certainly getting all banks or all members up to the ability to screen every single payment will be a challenge in itself. It is already a challenge at most domestic levels within the national schemes, and extending that internationally brings another challenges. Of course, we'll see a lot of improvements to the user experience because you're able to confirm the beneficiary as after you've provided the details. And that's sort of consistent with most of the real-time payment schemes at the national level now. I think banks will benefit by being able to offer a range of options for remittances to their customers. So as I said earlier, you could still use SWIFT, of course. There'll be Nexus for ASEAN. And broader, you have a variety of private networks from Visa, MasterCard, etc., arising, as well as future initiatives in the same space and the bank's own networks themselves. So there's quite a lot of choice now for cross-border initiatives, and I think that can only benefit customers in the end. And the banks will make sure that there's a consistent user experience across all those different channels.
Thank you so much. And this is a great segue to come to the last part of the webinar, which is addressing audience questions, but also just one parting thought, which is, where do you see the future of cross-border payments evolving beyond Project Nexus, specifically given that CBDCs and blockchain has been mentioned a little bit even in this last 50 minutes. So maybe I can take this question to the BIS team first before we take the audience Q&A.
Yeah, maybe I can take this question. Thanks, Monica. And I think in principle, we think that there's no one-size-fits-all solution in cross-border payments. And it is likely to be a coexistence of different rails, some of which are more effective in serving the needs of different stakeholders, be it consumers, SMEs, or even businesses. Hence, I think what the design principle that we adopt in Nexus is to ensure that it is interoperable with other alternative rails that will be out there in the future, including perhaps in the future CBDC systems that may exist both at the domestic or cross-border level. And perhaps another perspective as well is that in terms of cross-border settlement, if you look at Project Nexus, we rely on FX providers that will maintain accounts in the banks of two jurisdictions. So how can we make this more efficient moving forward? Does the programmability or even some of the protocols that we see in the crypto space, just to also highlight, in BIC Innovation Hub in Singapore, we have a project, Mariana, that is experimenting on how automated market maker mechanism can help enhance the FX services for cross-border payments. So these are some of the experimentation. They are still in early days, and we hope to bring the learnings from all these exploratory projects to future phases of Project Nexus, or even in other cross-border payments projects, such that we can collectively continue to drive greater progress in enhancing cross-border payments.
Thank you so much, Kaki. Just the last two questions from audience. Maybe we can take it in the next 30 seconds to 60 seconds, so very short answers. But one question from Carrie is, what might be the ultimate expression of Nexus look like? Where do you localize, regionalize the multilateral switch technology? What could the ownership of the technology be and the scheme look like? Kaki, I think you'd like to address this, or Ben?
Yeah, I can comment on this. So this is very similar to Nicholas's question as well. So who would own and operate the Nexus platform? This is something we're looking at in the next phase of the work. It could be that we have to establish a new entity, but it could also be that there is an existing payment system operator who has the relevant experience to do that. And CarKit in particular is leading a whole work stream looking at the governance and the rule book and how you would manage something like this in a cross-border context.
Got it. And the other question is from Frank. He asked, how are the different versions of ISO 2022 and local market practices will be managed? What are the interoperability measures provided centrally?
Yeah, there's so we would have a recommended kind of market practice for Nexus payments. The Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure, the CPMI, is also doing a consultation now on harmonizing the use of ISO 20022 for cross-border payments. And there's some very good recommendations in there, all of which are already adopted in Nexus. So I think there is even within that standard, there are differences, but there is hopefully a move towards harmonizing the way that these messages are used.
Okay, this is brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to Kaki, Yinfan, and of course Stephen for such an amazing session. So much to learn. With that, I'll hand over back to Camilla.
Yeah, I echo that. And everybody, before you leave, just big applause. I would say, I started off saying that this is my favorite topic. This might be my favorite webinar so far. It's so many different areas that we can keep on building on. So thank you so much for taking the time. I could talk to length of all the ideas coming out of this discussion, yes, but we have to do that another time. I think everybody has meetings to go to. CarKit, Ben, Jinfan, Stephen, Monica, would love to have you back another time. And all of you who dialed in, spread the words and spread the recordings, because this one was fantastic. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon again.